Have you ever started a game and felt like you couldn't stop worrying about what was going to happen? Have you ever felt like your thoughts were racing all over the place, your arms, your legs were just shaking, and you couldn't control it during a game? If so, then you've likely experienced sports performance anxiety. So what I want to do is go into detail on what sports performance anxiety is, the cause of sports performance anxiety, how this negatively affects you as an athlete, and then 2 different approaches that you can take to managing your sports performance anxiety. Sports performance anxiety is defined by extreme worries about what may or may not happen. Now, typically, this will be focused on what you don't want to have happen. And a lot of times we see this sports performance anxiety accompanied by the fear of failure because you are afraid of what might happen during the game, right? So let's say just making a mistake. So then you grow anxious as the game gets closer, as the game begins, and as you play because you're worried about not wanting to make that mistake. Now, when you're experiencing this sports performance anxiety, like I mentioned in the introduction, for the most part, you'll notice this because of the physical symptoms that you feel. Yes, as we'll talk about here in a second, thoughts are at the root and the core of this sports performance anxiety, but the real thing that's just in your face and the thing that tells you, okay, I'm very anxious right now, is the feeling that you get or the different symptoms that you have. So the main signs and symptoms of sports performance anxiety will include rapid heartbeat, a dry mouth, trembling hands and legs, a shaky voice, sweating, dizziness, blurred vision, lightheadedness, feeling of coldness maybe, just pretty much all the symptoms and all those signs that you feel whenever you're feeling anxious, but it will just be taken to the extreme. Now, an example of this is of a basketball player that I worked with, and he was telling me that going into a game, he felt so anxious that his legs would tremble to the point where he didn't feel like he had any control over his legs. Now, I don't know about you, but playing a basketball game where I didn't feel like I have any control over my legs doesn't sound like a basketball game that I would play very well in. And that's exactly what was happening to him. He was not performing well because of his performance anxiety. Then what would happen as soon as he got anxious is that he would end up getting anxious about being anxious. He would become fearful of these symptoms because he knew how much they hurt him. So that's another cause of anxiety is anxiety itself. Because if you're anxious during a game and you know that when you get anxious, you underperform, naturally, you'll start becoming worried about getting anxious, and the worry itself drives more feelings of anxiety. Now, for a personal example, I dealt with a lot of performance anxiety when I was playing baseball. I can remember standing up to bat, being in the batter's box, and literally trembling. I could feel my legs tremble, my arms were shaking, and I was thinking at that moment, I wonder if everybody else can notice that I'm shaking. Now, if I'm standing in the batter's box, looking at the pitcher, trying to hit this fastball, and I'm thinking about, can other people tell that I'm trembling in the box? Well, I don't think I have to explain that. That wasn't a very good recipe for hitting at a high level. But what also happened was I also experienced, just like the basketball player did, this worry about being anxious. As soon as I noticed that I was feeling nervous, as soon as I felt myself get that churning feeling in my stomach and I would start to think about this game, I would grow even more worried because I would say, okay, I shouldn't feel nervous. I can't feel anxious. Then I would get more anxious. Now, I think it's helpful for us to break performance anxiety down into a little bit more detail to really get clear as to how this process works, how this process is going on in our mind, so we can really understand how do we overcome and manage this anxiety. So performance anxiety in sports is broken into 3 different factors. The first factor is cognition. The second factor is autonomic arousal. And then the third factor is the behavioral response. For the behavioral response, think about your actions or the way that you play. Now, for the first factor, cognition, this is all about your thinking. What are you thinking about? What are you focused on going into the game and during the game? Now, do you remember a second ago where I was describing what sports performance anxiety is? And I said sports performance anxiety is defined by extreme worries about what may or may not happen during the game. Now, those worries show us this cognition factor. Whenever you are feeling anxious, and you're going into a game or you're in practice even, because I've worked with a lot of players and I've personally experienced anxiety even during practice. But no matter if it's practice or a game, if you are feeling anxious, we know that the first factor is your thinking. It's a cognitive response, so a thinking response to the situation that you're in. or to the situation that you will be in if we're talking about you being in bed or just, being in your dorm room or your house the night before a game and you're starting to feel anxious then as well. So that's the first factor, your cognition, what you're thinking about in relation to the game. How you think equals the anxiety, or it drives this anxiety. And it drives the anxiety because how you think, so the cognitive response, so your thoughts in that moment, lead to the autonomic arousal. And all of this, by the way, is happening in a split second, right? It's not like it's this one and then this one and then this one. It happens very quickly. But once again, I think it's great for us to break this down because it helps us get clear on which of these factors can we work on first to really make the most benefit or the most impact on your sports performance anxiety. So the autonomic arousal means that you have this response to the thoughts or to the cognitive response you have in that moment. You have an autonomic arousal response where you start to feel all the physical symptoms that I described. And so the simplest way for you to think about this is after I have the thoughts about whatever it is I'm worried about, my mind reacts with the autonomic arousal, and that's when I start to feel that churning feeling in my stomach. Hands tremble, legs tremble, you get the dry mouth, shaky voice, whatever it might be, but that's when you experience those physical symptoms of the sports performance anxiety. And a lot of times, like I said earlier, that's what you'll notice first. You realize I'm feeling anxious because of the autonomic arousal. Now, the third factor is the behavioral response. So we have the cognition, so you're thinking, the autonomic arousal, so you're feeling, and now we have the behavioral response. This is your action. Now, the actions that you take whenever you are playing as a result of sports performance anxiety highlight why this sports performance anxiety hurts you, which we'll get into more detail on here in a second. But the behavioral response typically will be you trying to avoid whatever it is that you're worried about. And this is where you can really run into trouble, like I said, we'll talk about here in a second. But with this 3-factor breakdown of sports performance anxiety, where we want to look first when we are really searching for the cause of this sports performance anxiety is that first factor, cognition. So the cognitive response that you have in the moment to whatever the situation is or whatever the situation will be, if you're thinking today about a game that you have tomorrow, you start feeling anxious about that game tomorrow today because you're thinking about the game that will happen in the future. But that right there shows us what's driving this feeling of anxiety, the thought about the future. And this is known as outcome-oriented thinking. No matter what athlete I've worked with, no matter what sport they play, at the core of their sports performance anxiety is outcome-oriented thinking. Outcome-oriented thinking means that your mindset or your thinking and your attention is fixed more on the future, so the outcome of your performance, instead of what's happening right now. If you're fully focused on what's happening right now in the moment, you won't be feeling anxious. Because anxiety, once again, is defined by extreme worries about what may or may not happen. That what may or may not happen is in the future. It's not what is or is not happening right now. It's what may or may not happen. So, the reason I like to break it down into those 3 factors, because it helps us get very clear on what's causing the anxiety in the first place. It's your thinking. The outcome-oriented thinking that you have, so your focus being too much on the future, on what might happen, drives these feelings of anxiety. Now, when you're feeling this anxiety, when you're thinking too much about the future, this will lower your performance. I've seen it happen personally. I've seen it happen to so many different athletes, and it's incredibly frustrating. And this a lot of times is where you find yourself performing better in practices than in games, because in practice, for the most part, there's not a whole lot to feel anxious about. Now, once again, personally and also with other athletes, I've seen sports performance anxiety in practice, especially if you're worried about playing time, but it's not usually as severe as it is in games, because games, now you have the stat line that you have to worry about, you have the people in the stands, you have the other team that you need to beat. So there are a lot more worries present during games. But no matter if you're performing well in practice, not performing well in games, not performing well in either of them, and you only perform well when you're training on your own, we do know that this sports performance anxiety will hold you back. And the reason that it holds you back is because of the physical symptoms that the anxiety causes, the tension and stress that the anxiety causes, and then also the fact that you will hold yourself back. Now, the physical symptoms, the reason that this lowers your performance is pretty much because of the basketball player example that I gave earlier. If you are playing basketball with trembling legs and you don't feel like you have any control over your legs, you will not perform up to your potential. If you're a baseball player like me, or like I was, and you're experiencing trembling legs and a trembling body in the batter's box, you won't be ready to hit the next pitch. I've also worked with tennis players who've told me that they black out when they go out there to play because their minds are racing so much. They're feeling so anxious, they get so dizzy that they just don't really have any control over their thinking, and it honestly feels like they just black out for the game, and then after the game they think, I have no idea why I played like that. I have no idea what happened. I just feel like I was blank out there. So the physical symptoms, that autonomic arousal in response to the way you're thinking, so those worries you have about the future, they will lower your performance because it is very tough to perform at your peak levels whenever you are experiencing these physical symptoms of sports performance anxiety. Now, the next part of this, the tension and stress, it builds off of the physical symptoms, but really this is because of the worries that you have. When you are wanting so badly to perform well, you're trying to force this good performance, right? You're really just trying to succeed out there. Do you think that you'll play nice and relaxed? You'll let go, you'll be calm? Or do you feel like you'll play tense and you will be stressed the entire game about how you'll perform? An example of this comes from a pitcher that I'm working with right now. He and I actually just had our first call yesterday, and we were talking about some struggles that he's had on the mound. And he was telling me that the struggles that he has on the mound are because he so desperately wants to pitch well. And right now he hasn't been pitching well for an extended period of time, so this pressure and the stress that he's putting on himself is getting even worse. Now he is very anxious when he plays because, once again, he wants to perform well. But he was also telling me that he feels like he needs to put the pressure on himself to perform well because he can't keep walking batters, otherwise he will keep getting pulled from games and he'll start losing his starting position. Now all of that is true. I mean, it's true that if you keep walking batters or in any other sport you keep performing badly, you'll get pulled from the game and you'll likely lose your starting position. But it's the pressure that he's putting on himself to perform so well because he hasn't been performing well recently that's only worsening the problem. Whenever you want to perform so badly that you feel yourself tense and you feel yourself stressed and you're almost trying to force a really good performance, this is a sign that you need to let go. Because when you're trying to force a good performance, probably about 7 out of 10 times or so, you will not perform up to your peak levels because you're trying to force it, and so you're playing tense. When you're playing tense, you don't play quick, you don't make as effective of decisions, and you're not just allowing yourself to play naturally and freely like you've trained to do. And then the third element of this, or the third reason that this sports performance anxiety can hold you back, is because of you actually holding yourself back. Now, the example for this comes from a soccer player that I worked with. Now, a soccer player and I worked together last fall, so we finished working together at this point, and he's seen tremendous improvement within his game. Now, when his parents first reached out to me, what they told me was that their son seemed like he was hiding out there. You know, he worked really hard on his own. He was performing pretty well in practice. But it was almost like a completely different player when it came to games because he was holding himself back. And the way that he was holding himself back was that he was avoiding plays. He would avoid the ball. It was a little bit like he was kind of hiding out there. The ball would be over here. He would be standing over here. And now, this wasn't completely evident to everybody that was watching, but because they were his parents, they knew how well he could play. They recognized that he was 100% holding himself back. And he also recognized it when he and I started talking together and started working together. Now, if you want to perform well so badly that you are worried about not performing well, why would you hide out there? Why would you hold yourself back? Well, the reason has more to do with being worried about not performing well than it does wanting to play well. So remember earlier when we were defining sports performance anxiety and I said that most of the time the worries you have will be about what you don't want to have happen? Well, when you don't want something negative to happen, the natural response is to avoid, right? It's to play it safe. It's to hold yourself back because playing it safe and playing just decent and okay that day is better to your mind and safer to your mind than playing aggressively, which can feel risky, like you're increasing your chances of making mistakes. And remember, mistakes are what you are trying to avoid. That's what you don't want to have happen. And so that's what this soccer player was experiencing. He was holding himself back because he didn't want to make mistakes. That's what he was so anxious about. He didn't want to be pulled from the game. He didn't want to lose his starting position. He didn't want people to be mad at him. So he held himself back. He avoided situations where he could make mistakes. Now, unfortunately, he also avoided situations where he could succeed. And that's not at all what you want to be doing as a player. You don't want to just play in the background, let everybody else succeed, and you just avoid mistakes. You want to be playing aggressively, you want to go out there, and you most importantly want to be okay with making mistakes. That doesn't mean you want to make mistakes, but you have to be okay with making mistakes so that you don't fear mistakes. Because when you fear mistakes, you grow anxious, then you hold yourself back. Now, if you are experiencing this sports performance anxiety, if you do feel like you're holding yourself back, you're playing with tension, what can you do? Well, there are 2 approaches that you can take. The first approach involves 4 different mental training techniques that you can use to manage this sports performance anxiety. The second approach involves some pregame exercises that you can actually use right before the game starts to reduce your anxiety. And I recommend using both of them because the first approach is more of a long-term approach where you're going to keep using these tools on an ongoing basis to manage this anxiety. And the other approach is just piecing together a pregame routine for yourself in essence. And a pregame routine is one of the things that I've seen the most success with when it comes to helping athletes with their sports performance anxiety. Now, the first approach, the 4 techniques, are better seen as 4 different steps. And they are acceptance, preparing, visualization, and letting go of expectations. So that first one, acceptance. The reason that it's so important to accept the fact that you're anxious is because of what we were talking about earlier when it comes to getting anxious about being anxious. The last thing you want to do is find yourself anxious about not wanting to be anxious because you know how much that causes you to underperform. So now all of a sudden, you're just anxious. I mean, just playing anxious, not even because you're worried about underperforming per se, but you're just anxious about feeling anxious. And so that's why you have to accept. And acceptance is one of the most difficult things that you'll have to do as an athlete with sports performance anxiety because it's not fun to have to accept your anxiety because it feels really weird, to be honest with you. It feels like you are inviting the anxiety to stay because you're just going to say, okay, it's okay that I'm feeling anxious right now. That's fine. I can play well even though I'm anxious. That's a key part to this. And I want you to remind yourself that fighting your anxiety, wishing it wasn't there, is truly inviting it to stay, while accepting it and saying, I'm going to take away all resistance. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to tell myself that I shouldn't feel anxious. I do feel anxious right now. It's okay. Taking away the resistance. Because in the moment, as we'll talk about with these pregame exercises, in the moment, it's all about redirecting your attention. Because the anxiety is caused by the outcome-oriented thinking, so we need to redirect your attention to bring it more into the present moment. And you cannot redirect your attention if you're stuck focusing on the future and even on your own anxiety. Now, the second part to this, or the second technique, is to make sure that you're prepared. You have to be as prepared as possible in order to manage your anxiety. Because if you're more prepared, you're more confident. If you're more confident, you are less anxious. And funny enough, an example of this comes from my own life, and it doesn't even have anything to do with sports, actually. And so the example that I always like to give is that I was super anxious to give a speech one time, to a point where I was wanting to avoid it. I didn't want to have to go give this speech. But what I did with tons and tons of time, so it was about a few months away, what I did was I wrote the speech and I memerized it, and I practiced it every single day to the point where when I gave the speech, it was just straight from my memory. I felt a little nervous, a little anxious, but nothing at all like I have in the past when I've had to talk in front of people because I was so prepared. And so for you as an athlete, the more prepared you are, right, the more reps you've taken, the more you've studied your opponent, the more that you've gone over your game plan and strategy, the more you can fall back on that and the more you can trust that. And then the next technique is visualization. Visualization builds off this idea of preparation because the preparation that I was just talking about is more about reps and it's more about physical preparation. But you can also use mental preparation or mental imagery and mental rehearsal in the form of visualization. What you do with this is you just imagine yourself performing the skill or the situation, or imagine yourself in the situation where you feel the most anxious. For example, if you are anxious about serving in tennis, you just visualize yourself serving over and over and over again. The more you visualize, the more you're building the memory of success, the more confidence you have, and once again, the less anxious you feel. Now, the last technique involves letting go of expectations. Now, these expectations, they're not about you not wanting to perform well. It's more about expectations that are based on the outcome. Because remember, the anxiety is driven by this outcome-oriented thinking. So the more you can take your attention off of this outcome, put it more onto the process, the less anxious you'll feel. And an exercise that I always run athletes through is where we look at their expectations and we try to reframe them to controllable mini goals. So instead of thinking, I have to get 3 hits today, the controllable mini goal would be, I need to make sure that I have productive at-bats. And so then we would break that down even farther and think, what does a productive at-bat look like for you? So you can do the same thing for yourself, where you let go of these high expectations and reframe them to more controllable mini goals. Now, in addition to those 4 techniques, you also want to make sure that you use some pregame exercises to help with your sports performance anxiety. Now, there are 6 pregame exercises that I love to use, and I would recommend you choosing maybe a couple of them. You don't need to use all 6 of them. And in fact, if you do use all 6, that might be a little too much for you pregame. But choose a couple of these exercises that you like, put them into practice as a pregame routine, and this can really help with your sports performance anxiety. So the first technique, or the first exercise, is to remember past successes. Whenever you remember past successes, this is filling your mind with times where you've performed well. And whenever you're anxious, your mind is filled with times or scenarios where you won't perform well, because that's what you're worried about. That's what you're anxious about. I'm anxious and I'm worried about what I don't want to have happen. Now, if I'm anxious and worried about what I don't want to have happen, my mind is filled with thoughts of the future in terms of mistakes. We want to make sure that your thoughts are filled with times where you've played well. Now, I know this is a little different from me saying that you want to focus more in the present moment, because you are thinking about the past, but we're thinking about the past in a good way to be able to help you be more present focused, because when you think of times you've done well, you trust yourself more in the moment. When you trust yourself more in the moment, you will be more present. So maybe make a list for yourself of some past successes that you've had. Think about them before you play, and that can help increase that confidence. Exercise number 2 is to create a self-talk routine. A self-talk routine is a list of simple statements that you can repeat to yourself before games that works to boost your confidence and to calm your mind. Something that can really help with this is going through and thinking about all the negative thoughts that you might have, or all the anxious thoughts you might have. Then making a list that is the alternative, the more positive alternative to each one of those anxious and worrisome thoughts. And then what you do is you read through that list every time before you're about to play. And then the next exercise is setting a clear definition for success. This is pretty similar to the idea of letting go of expectations and reframing your expectations to more controllable mini goals. Because whenever you set a new definition of success, the definition of success that you set will not be based on the outcome. Because remember, we're trying to reduce the anxiety, and the anxiety is caused by you thinking about the future, thinking about that outcome. So instead, we want to focus more on what you can control. So whenever you're setting a definition of success and you are experiencing sports performance anxiety, I recommend setting a definition of success that's based on something you can control, that's part of the process. And we trust that if you do this thing and you really do it well, it increases the chances of you getting the outcome that you want, or avoiding the outcome that you don't want to have happen. The next exercise is focusing on your breathing. So whenever you're feeling anxious, and we know that you have that rapid heartbeat, right? You'll have shallow breathing. The more you can take deep breaths, the calmer you'll be. And so the type of breathing that I always recommend is count breathing, where you breathe in for a certain count, then out for a certain count. Let's say you breathe in for 5, out for 5. And you do this over and over again to help center your attention in the present moment, and to also help calm yourself down by focusing on your breathing. The next exercise is actually to practice gratitude. Right? If you're feeling really just grateful to be out there and play, you're thinking, I'm so grateful that I get to be out here with my teammates, I get to be out here and play the sport that I love, there's not a whole lot of room for anxiety there. Right? The anxiety is thinking, I have to play well today, I have to do this, I have to do that, I hope this doesn't happen. You're completely losing sight of the fact that you're just getting to play. The more grateful you are, to just be able to play, the less anxious you'll be, because it's really hard to be grateful and anxious at the same time, because they're completely different thoughts and completely different feelings. And then the last exercise is to just focus on having fun. This one's pretty similar to the gratitude one, because if you're focusing on what you enjoy, you are focusing on having fun out there, you're not so worried about the future. You're not so worried about what will happen, will I play well, this or that. You're just focused on, I'm out here, I'm enjoying myself with my teammates, I'm playing hard, and I'm just having fun. In addition to these 2 approaches, I also offer one-on-one mental performance coaching for sports performance anxiety. So if you are interested in learning more about the one-on-one coaching I offer, I've put a link to that in the description below. No matter what approach you take, one thing is for certain. In order to overcome sports performance anxiety, it takes action. It takes you working to calm yourself down and working to redirect your attention into the present moment, because we know at the core of this sports performance anxiety is your thinking about the future. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I put out new videos each week on sports psychology and mental training. If you would like me to cover any other topics or you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below.